Hello everyone, welcome to part 3 of the Workflows webinar series. This one is going to be about how to create custom workflow tools in the Oasys LS-DYNA environment. So a little bit about me. My name's Harry and I'm an apprentice at Arup within our Oasys LS-DYNA team. I've been here for more than 2 years now. I've touched on the encryption tool, did some work on seatbelt anchorage, and more recently I've been working in the workflows team, which is what I'm here today to talk about. Before we get into the webinar, if you would like to know more about any topic, or maybe you've missed parts 1 and 2 of this workflow webinar series, then please go to our website, Oasys-software/Dyna. The link is just at the bottom of this slide, and then navigate to training and take a look at our past webinars or tutorials. You can also check out our YouTube channel where we upload lots of content, and in fact you might be watching this webinar back on YouTube today. If you'd like to be up to date with upcoming training and webinars and other news, the Oasys team sends a monthly newsletter and you can sign up using the link at the bottom of the screen. And for those joining us live, if you have any questions during the webinar, then please write any questions you have in the text box. So we're going to cover lots of things today to do with creating your own workflow tool. The main aspects being creating your own workflow scripts, including using the GUI builder to help you out, highlighting the workflows class in our Oasys JavaScript API, creating the workflow definition file, and then some further more advanced ideas at the end, such as reading in previously saved data in Primer, single model versus multiple model workflows, creating workflows with no required data, and using modules within your scripts. So today we're going to build a fairly basic workflow tool. So what is a workflow? If you've watched parts 1 and parts 2 of this series, then you might already know, but just in case, a workflow is simply a tool written using JavaScript that A, gets data from the user in Primer, B, stores the data with the model, and C, uses the data in our post-processing software to provide some extra functionality. What the data contains and what it is used for is entirely up to the creator of the tool. Conceptually, you can think of it as a user-defined ZTF file. Workflows is a way of linking up your pre and post scripts that you might already have or that you might want to create. In Primer, to tag the model with data, we can write to a .json file that will be picked up in the post-processing software, or we can write to the model itself using post*end data. We will go into more detail on this later on. So, as I briefly just mentioned, in this webinar we're going to make a very basic version of the Entities of Interest tool. In fact, I've already made this basic tool, the parts of interest tool that we're going to create, and I'm going to show you it in a minute just so you can see what we're going to aim to build towards. So when you're making your own workflows, you should ask yourself the following questions though. So firstly, what will it do? Well, in this example tool, we're going to have a GUI in Primer that will allow the user to select the parts of interest and save the data required for use in D3plot. In D3plot, it will use the saved information and you can only or highlight the parts of interest. Second question is, what data will it need? Firstly, the name of a group of parts of interest and then the parts themselves and their IDs. The next question is then, will it run on single and or multiple models? And this tool is going to run on a single model. So you can easily see what I'm going to build for the purpose of this webinar. This will be our end goal. So let's go workflows and then parts of interest. So this is what we're going to aim to build. So we've got nice and easy, just a name box, and then we've got a select button, an add button, Save to File button, and a Save to Model button. So let's just very quickly add some wheels on like we did with the previous one. Press Apply, press Add, and there we have wheels. And then we're also going to do bumper. So select the bumper, front bumper, press Apply, and Add. Once we're here, again, we've got Save to File and Save to Model. So I'm just going to Save to File, and then we're going to call this parts.json, which I had already made in the past, so we're just going to overwrite that. And again, open up D3plot or your post-processing software. So for this example, it's going to be D3plot. And then once it loads in, just got to wait for the model to load. And then we've got workflows again in the top right hand menu. So we're going to click on workflows, open up parts of interest, and here we've got wheels and bumper. And then we're going to highlight the bumper. There we go. Highlight everything. There we go. And then we'll just press reset. Cool. So that is effectively what we're going to build in our webinar today. So the first thing we're going to do is start looking at building a primer GUI. Before we start building anything, here is a quick overview of how we will set up our workflow tool. Firstly, we will build our primer script, then build our post script, followed by creating a workflow definition file. At this point, the workflow will run in the workflows framework, and from then on, we can either start to use our workflow or decide to continue improving our workflow. The purpose of the pre-process script that runs in Primer is to get data that will be required in the post-processing software and store it with the model so that the D3plot script and or THIS script can access it. This is done by saving user data to a JSON file or to a keyword file with post-star and data. We will use helper functions such as workflow definition file name, write to file, and write to model, which I will run through later. File locations. The first thing to set up is our locations where we want to save our scripts. You can create your workflows in 4 different locations. These are home, OA install, OA admin, or a user directory that is defined with a preference. For this demo, I'm going to create my workflows in my Oasys install location. From here, we'll then navigate to a folder called Workflows. In here, you can see we've got this scripts folder, and that's where all of our scripts are going to be stored. And then here, you can see these files, these .json files. These are what we call our workflow definition files, and we'll get back to these later once we've created our scripts. For now, just click on scripts, and we're going to create a new folder called parts of interest. Okay. Once we've got that, we're now going to create 2 new folders, one called pre and one called post. You don't have to follow this exact format because you can find files and scripts and point to their different locations within the workflow definition file that I mentioned a minute ago. But for this example, we're just going to follow this format. If you go back up a level, in fact back up 2 levels into the workflows directory, you can also see thumbnails, and this is where you can add your thumbnail for the workflow tool that you might want to create. And that's what will show up within the Workflows Framework GUI that pops up in Primer and within the post-processing software. Typically, the script will have a GUI for the user to select the required data from the models or model in Primer. The first step is to create the GUI. I advise you to use a GUI builder to help you build your GUI. This can be found by clicking on JavaScript in the Tools menu and then GUI Builder. From here, you can begin to create your GUI by adding widgets and so on. If you need a more in-depth run-through of using the GUI Builder, then go to our website at oasys-software.com/dyna and then go to Training, then Webinars, then Past Webinars, and look for the webinar named GUI Builder in the Oasys LS-DYNA Environment from the 23rd of May 2023. Building a GUI to get data from the user. So let's begin building our parts of interest tool by creating our primer GUI. Remember, your workflow can do anything, so it won't necessarily look anything like mine when you build yours. However, one aspect that you should have in your primer GUI are the two buttons, Save to File and Save to Model. So we're not going to click on the Workflows tab, we're going to go JavaScript and then GUI Builder. From here, you can load in, save them, etc, etc. Again, if you want more help with this GUI Builder, go and find Jared's GUI Builder webinar that he did in May. So we're going to start completely from scratch, and the first thing I'm going to do is, let's just make this a little bit smaller so it's going to be a bit easier. So we're going to go with 100 by 100 on the window. And then let's start to add some widgets. So the first thing is going to be our name label. So just going to follow this naming convention where we're going to have underscore of what it is and then the name. So and then text name. Obviously you can do all sorts of stuff here, but remember we're just going to make this fairly simple. So it's not going to be the best looking GUI. We're just going to make it quickly and easy for you to follow, and then going to add a text box. So we're going to go here, drag it all along, and we'll call it txt name. And there we go. Rather than add in all the widgets now, I'll use a GUI builder file I've created earlier just to show you what it will look like. So we're going to go and just fetch one that I've used before in here. So you're going to want to build something a little bit like this. So it's got the 4 buttons and the list box at the bottom. Once you've got that, you then want to go File, Save, and then within our scripts, we're going to go Parts of Interest and then Pre. And then in here, save it as Pre Parts of Interest GUI, and then it's a .jsi file, and then save. Now the GUI's been built, we will take a look at the code it's created, and then have a look at building our Oasys primer script. So here we have our parts of interest GUI that was created by the GUI builder, and here is all the code for it, and it's about 250 lines long. So yeah, this file was generated by Oasys, obviously, which we know. And again, just to reiterate the point, do not edit it unless you know what you're doing. So I'm going to tell you that, and then the first thing I'm going to tell you to do is we want to export this GUI so we can use it in our pre-side script. So we're going to do on line 5, export GUI, and save it. We do this so it can be imported into the script using the JavaScript ES6 modules rather than the use function, which makes for a better coding experience. And now we're going to want to start to create our pre-scripts. So I'm using Visual Studio Code, but you can use whatever you want, obviously. But this is what you've got to do in Visual Studio Code. So we're going to right click on pre, new file, and then we're going to call it pre parts of interest.js. There we go. Right, now we can start building our script. So first thing we're just going to do is make sure we can use modules, and then we're just going to do a TS ignore of this first step. And this first step is importing the GUI from our pre-parts of interest GUI.jsi file. So let's go import GUI, and then that's going to be from, and then in here we're going to need the exact file location and the exact script name of your GUI. So that is my one, and then going to go like that at the end to finish it off. And then from now that's in there, we can start to use our GUI whenever we want to. So the next step will be to start writing some actual code. Now I'm not going to go through absolutely every single line by line, because like I've said, your script and what your workflow will do is going to be different to mine. But I'm going to go through the main points, especially the workflow API calls, in fairly hefty detail, so it makes sense for you. So first of all, again, I'm using Visual Studio Code to write my script, as it checks for any problems and any potential errors for you, which can be helpful. However, for some reason, it highlights line 3, and that's why we've got the TS ignore line here, as that tells VS Code to ignore the error. Now, the workflow definition file name is the name of the workflow definition JSON file, and that's what we're going to get on line 11. This is copied into the output JSON file and is needed so that D3plot and THIS know which script to run when the workflow is selected. The workflow definition file name is passed by the workflows framework, and there's a helper function, which is what we've got here, workflow.workflow definition file name, to get that. So that's going to return the definition file name, and then we're just going to keep it as a global argument and workflow file name. Then we've got 3 more global things. So we've got let m. That's simply just going to hold the global variable for our model. And then we've got the parts of interest. That's just going to be an object where we'll store our data for putting into the JSON file at the end. And then we've got let parts ID. So when we're selecting entities, that's going to be the ID of the selected parts. We've then got this setup function, which I'll show you next, and that's going to be the main part of our script and the first function that we enter. And we've got got to make sure that that is before the GUI.window.show function. As mentioned beforehand, the only functions that you should have in your pre-sized scripts for every workflow will be save to file and save to model. The rest you can build however you would like, as per a normal script. So simply, this first function sets up the window with callback functions from the GUI and selects the model to be used. It is worth noting that workflows can be set up with multiple models in Primer, but typically you'll only want to set up one model at a time, which simplifies the script. So if you have multiple models loaded into Primer, your script should ask which one to use. So that's what we do here from lines 31 to 35. So you need to select a model before we can use this workflow. We've got that in if you don't have any model selected in your primer session, but if you do, it simply asks you which one you want to use and then saves that in the global argument m, which we set up further up here. And then these bottom things are the callbacks for our GUI. When you press the select button in the GUI, it will lead to this function. The right-hand side selection window will appear for you to select your parts of interest. This function doesn't have any special workflow features, so I'm not going to go into it into too much detail, but effectively you set a flag, you pick your parts, the parts enter the flag, then loops through all the parts, and if it's flagged, it then grabs the text of the label, so the ID of that part, and then sets the text to those part IDs. The next function is the add function, and this is what we will get into when the add button is pressed on the GUI. So in here, simply, we're just going to grab the name from the name text box in the GUI and the parts from the part IDs variable from the previous select function. And then we're going to add those into the list box by creating a new widget item, and then we're going to add them to the parts of interest array, which we will use later on in our save to file and save to model functions. So here we are then, the save to file function, which I've been talking about for a long time. And this is the one that you should see on every single workflow. It's not going to look exactly the same because obviously you're going to want to put different data into your JSON file depending on what your workflow does, but the format should look fairly similar. So the workflow.write-to-file API call is what writes the required data to the JSON file. So in here we've got a user data argument, and this is the object containing the information captured in Primer to be used by the post-processing script. So that's this data, and here this is where we're going to loop through the parts of interest objects that we created at the start of the script, and here we're just adding it into our data array, and then that is the user data argument on this write to file. The next one, the output file name. This is the argument which is the name of the file to write to. This can be a new file or it can be an existing file. So we're going to ask the user here where to write it to. So we're going to do file name equals window.getFile. It needs to be a .json file, and we're going to add in as well. If they don't actually select a file, then we just want to stop this function from happening. The next one is the workflow definition file name argument. This is what we set up at the start, and it's the name of the workflow definition JSON file. So we did this at the top of the script. There's also an optional extra data argument, which is an object containing any extra data that you want to write to a JSON file. A few examples of this is a model unit system that you might want to add to your data. So once again, that workflow file name bit is from right at the top here, where we grab the workflow definition file name. So that's one of the main parts of this script is save to file function, and that's the one that should be in all workflows. It's not going to look exactly the same as mine, but it should look different, similar in whatever you choose to build. The final function we've got in this pre-script is the function that saves to post start end data to our model. So that was the other option we can do if we don't want to save to a JSON file. So that simply saves the workflow data to the model. So as I said, for the most part, the function is the same as the save to file function. You can see creating this data array and adding the data into that array from our parts of interest object is exactly the same. However, you'll notice it doesn't ask for a file name as it's written to the model. Instead, we need to choose which model we want to select to write to, and that's if we've got multiple models open. And then the workflow.write-to-model API call then writes the required data as the post start end data in the start primer user data keyword. And again, we've got the same kind of argument. So data is obviously the one where all the data goes in. The model is the model that you've selected, which in the save to file was the file name argument, and then the workflow file name once again is that same argument that we're going to add, which got the definition file name for the workflow. Just so you can see, here's the output of those files. So this first one is the output of the .json file. So we've got workflows, and then we've got the workflow definition, which is our parts of interest, and then we've got the data that we added in. So the roof, the hood, and then the parts that are connected to that. And then this example is what happens if you write it out as post star end data by saving to the model. So you've got star primary user data, and then you've got workflow start, and then workflow end, and then between that, this section here is basically exactly the same as what you see in the JSON file. The purpose of the post-processing script is to read the user data and then provide the desired functionality using that data. What the functionality is entirely up to the creator of the workflow. When a workflow is selected by the user in the workflow menu, it is automatically passed the user data saved from primer and the number of models that were selected in the menu. The workflow functions model user data from index and number of selected models can be used to read this data in our post script. I'm about to show you the post side menu for the workflows framework, where all the workflows that have been created will show up. Don't be alarmed that there's a part of interest workflow already there. This is just because I've created one before the webinar. For you, that won't show up because we've not yet created the workflow definition file for our parts of interest workflow. So here we have our workflows menu within our post software. So you can see I've got 4 models loaded in here, and this is just an example of what we can do. So you can see parts of interest here. Because we've got multiple models loaded in, we're only able to select one of those. Now, an example if we have a multiple model workflow is we can either pick single model, again from one of the 4, or multiple models, and then we can select a mixture of at least 2 models here. So for example, if there's 4 models in D3plot and we select model number 1 and model number 3 to run the workflow on, then the indices for each model will be 0 and 1 in the model user data from index function. And that's the function that's going to be able to let us grab all the data for each model that we stored and saved within our JSON data or post star end data within our prescript. There's then another function called number of selected models, and this returns the number of selected models that's been picked by the user in the workflows menu. We'll touch on this a bit later on when we look into multiple model workflows, but a common situation where these functions will be used together is when you're first collecting data in the post side. You will then need to do a call for number of selected models if it's a multiple model workflow, and then after that you can loop through whatever the number of selected models were, and then within the loop you can call the model user data from index function to get the data for each model selected. Building a GUI for Oasys Post. So the first thing to do then is to create our post GUI. So I'm not going to go through it all from scratch. I'm just going to load in one that I've made previously just to show you as an example. So I just load this one in that works from previously. So all we've got is a list box here, and then we've got 3 buttons: reset, only, and highlight. So once you've created your post GUI, you're going to go again, press save, and then you're going to want to put it in scripts, and then parts of interest, and then post, and then we're going to call it post parts of interest GUI, and then it's a .jsi file, and save that. Now we've created our post GUI, we'll now go back to Visual Studio Code and have a look at creating our Oasys post script. So here we are then, it's back into Visual Studio Code, and as you can see here is our post GUI that we made in the GUI builder, and this one is 160 lines long. So again, just on line 5, we're going to add our export GUI so we can grab our GUI from the post script and use it as the module. Now, we don't have our post script, so again, we're going to create a new file, and we're going to go post parts of interest.js, hit save, here we go, and again we want that module, so module true, and we're going to do a ts ignore, so this is just so we don't get errors, and then we're going to go import GUI from / and then the name of our post GUI, so post parts of interest GUI.jsi, and there we go. We are now ready to make our post script. So this is the start of our post script, and it is worth noting that I'm using js.comments. So they're these things here, and they're basically going to help me check the types of my variables, highlight any potential errors, and provide auto-completion for me. These are optional and are not required to make a workflow tool. So this one here is basically just got the parts of interest object, which is going to have the name and the parts in it. And then this one is the data object in the workflow file. And then within that data object, that's where we've got the parts of interest object. And then we're just going to have this global variable here, so called data. So in that global variable, we'll grab our data from the JSON file or post * data. And then the first thing to do will be jumping into our first function, and remember we want that before showing our window, otherwise it will get stuck. So here we go, this is our setup function. So the main part of this function is the data equals workflow dot model user data from index API call. So we'll only use one model, so we'll use model index 0. So this is the argument here. So the argument is model index. So we're going to stick that in there as 0. So this is only going to work with single models as workflow. So this will get the user data from the JSON file or the post * end data, just on this line here. So we're then going to loop through that data on line 39 to 42 and add each entry that we find within the data into the list box. So that's where we're going to loop through here all the parts of interest, the length of the parts of interest, and then we're going to grab to put into the new entry, firstly its name, and then we're going to have just a separator so we can see the parts, and then the parts IDs, which are obviously in there from our JSON or post * end data file. That's where we are making our entry for the list box, and then once again our callback functions for the 3 buttons on the GUI, so the reset button, the only button, and the highlight button. And so obviously we're going to create 3 functions for each, 3 functions, one for each of those in a minute. So here is our reset button function, extremely simple, and obviously again it's called when the user presses the reset button. Simply on line 53 unblanks everything, and then it sets the transparency of all the things to 0 and sets the color back to the original, and then ACs everything, and that's it. So the next 2 functions are only and highlight functions. That's when the only button gets pressed and the highlight button gets pressed in our GUI. So they both call the reset button function to start with, which is what we just walked you through, which obviously resets everything. And then they'll do the prep work for the action that they're going to complete. So the only function blanks everything, and then within the action function, that's when the unblanking will happen for it to actually be an only. And then within the highlight function, it sets the transparency of everything to 90% and then sets the color to grey for everything. And then within the action function, if we do highlights, that we're then going to set the color to red and the transparency to 0 for the parts that we're going to highlight. So I'll show you the action function next. That one is the only slightly complex function, but again, there's nothing workflows related necessarily in these. So the highlight, only, reset button, and action, there's nothing really workflows related in there, and they can be anything that you want to be in your script when you're creating your own. So as I said, the final action function in our script, slightly more complex. So the last thing to do, complete the action the user selected after the prep work has been done. So that prep work, as I said, has been done in the only and highlight functions. So in here, this function is going to loop through the list box and get the name of the selected entry that the user has selected to do action on. So that's going to happen from lines 94 to 101. Once that's happened, it's then going to loop through the workflow data. So this is using our workflows data, and then it's going to check if the name of the selected entry that we grabbed on line 101 matches the name of the data entry. So then if it does match, it then gets the parts from the workflow data entry, and then it can complete the action on those parts. So if we enter into here, here it's grabbing the parts from that piece of data, and then it's going to flip everything to the negative IDs, and then we're going to, if it's, as I mentioned before, if the method is only, we're going to unblank those parts. If the method is highlight, we're going to blank everything, unblank those parts. I'm going to redraw, and then just for those parts, we're going to set the things to red, and then take the transparency off. So setting the transparency to 0, and then we can unblank those parts and everything. And then the last thing we'll do at the end is we're just going to AC the screen. So yeah, that is our workflows post script done. So just remember, really, there's not loads of workflow stuff in here, just this data on line 35, which is grabbing the model user data from the index, and then we're doing things with that data on line 39 to 42 to add things into the list box. And then aside from that, the only thing again to do with the data really is on line 104, where we're checking if the data is matching the list box name, and then we're using the parts grabbed from that data on 108 to do our blanking and transparency and coloring parts for the highlighting. So the last thing to do to make our workflow to work is to create the workflow definition file. This is a JSON file which is static, only needs to be created once, and contains data about the tool, what it will do, how many models it can run on, and what scripts it will run. This is a step which will make the scripts we've created link together and pop up in the Workflows menu in both Primer and the Post side of your choice, which for my example is D3plot. So again, we're going to click on the Workflows up here, and you'll notice the parts of interest workflow is not available to use. So we're going to click Create Workflow Definition, and within here we're going to add our definition. So name is called parts of interest. So parts of interest. Description only, and highlight selected parts. Actions. So this is a manual script you do it yourself. The pre-process script. So let's find that, the pre one. So we're going to go to scripts, parts of interest, pre, and there we go. That's our pre parts of interest script selected. And then D3plot, we're going to go again post, and then select this, which is our post script. We don't have a t-hist one, so we're going to leave that there. Single model, yes it is. We can't use this one with multiple models. So the minimum multiple models and the maximum multiple models isn't going to show up, but you can select those. We've not created a thumbnail for it, so we're just going to leave that blank. The category, the category and the value we're just going to leave for now, but you can add different tags to things and add and remove however you want. So they're going to be things that pop up down the side here. So things like, is it manual? What sector is it in? What program is it in? Etc. So let's save that. Again, you can save this in your home area, OA install, OA admin, or a user-defined directory with a preference. But just for this example, we're going to save it in my OA install area in Oasys 20 and then workflows, and then we're going to call it parts of interest, and then it's a .json file, and then click save. With everything set up, we can now run our parts of interest workflow. So now we've created our workflow definition file, I would suggest restarting Primer, and then hopefully we can now find our workflow. So let's click on workflows in the tools menu, and there is our parts of interest workflow. So let's click on it, and then again just going to add a few simple things. So let's do roof, press apply, and then add, and then we'll do hood, because that's what it's called in this model. Press apply, and then add, and then we'll save to file, so call it parts of interest.json. Just to say, it is worth noting at this point that when you saved your JSON file, it doesn't need to be the same name as your workflow definition file. It can be whatever you want it to be. So with that saved, we should now be able to go and fire up D3plot to make it work in our post-processing software. So just let the model load in, and then our workflows again is going to be up in the top right hand side. So click on workflows, and then you'll see there's our part of interest one. We'll click on that, and here we've got our roof and our hood. So we can only that, and then we can highlight our roof. There we go. Our hood, sorry, and then we can highlight both things if we want to. Cool, and then we can reset it back to how it started. Cool, so there's our nice and simple part of interest tool. Again, you can make that as big, as complex as you like through more and more advanced features, some of which I'm going to show you next. Now that your workflow works, you can now go ahead and use it as you wish. I'm now going to show you a few more advanced ideas which could enhance your workflow even more. These include reloading previously saved data from Primer, multiple model workflows, and no required user data workflows. We'll now move on to reloading saved user data in the Oasys Primer script. So remember when we finished doing the script and we did a little quick example of running through the workflow. We clicked on workflows and we did parts of interest, and this came up, but we populated this with a roof and a hood. Now I've just restarted this workflow and it's completely blank again. Now there is something that we can do about that. The first advanced feature we will look at is reading in previously saved data in the pre-processing script. If the user has some saved data, either in a file or as post-ARN data, then it is useful to be able to get that data when running the Primer script, for example, to pre-populate the GUI with the previously saved data. The data gets passed to the script and can be accessed using the helper functions in the JavaScript API workflow class. These are number of models, model ID from index, model user data from index, and model unit system from index. So this is how we might change our first function setup script. So right at the top, and main thing that we've changed is just adding in this section here. So it's not very long, it's about 15 lines or so. And we'll start off with getting the data. So we'll do let data equals workflow dot model user data from index, and that's going to return the user data associated with the model that has data. And then what we're going to do is we'll loop through that data, and then simply we'll just add a widget item that we'll add into our list box with the entity name and the parts connected with that entity that we've found out from these two lines on 53 and 54. Once it's done that, we'll then save the data to the parts of interest array, ready for it to be added to the JSON file. One thing that's important for this is you should put it in a try catch, just in case that there's an error with reading the saved data. So you can see on line 65, I've just got this error message which says error reading saved data. So how is that code change going to change things in our GUI? So if we open up our part of interest workflow, we don't have to change anything in the workflow definition file. So once you've built a basic version of your script, you can then go and change things very easily and just simply click on it and it should show you the difference. So here we are. This is the saved data that you can remember we added earlier with the roof and the hood, and this is now in our pre-side. Multiple model workflows. Now, the next idea we can do to advance our workflows is by turning it into a workflow that will be able to be used with multiple models. So the first thing that we'll have to do is to change our workflow definition file. So we'll click on workflows and then we're going to click on create workflow definition, and then we're going to load in our old one. So go back to where you saved it when you first created it, and then we're going to click on parts of interest, and this is going to load in our old one. So all we've got to do now is simply single model. Yes, we still want it to work on a single model, and we also now want it to work on multiple models. So set that to yes. The minimum multiple models we're going to have is 2, and then the maximum we can set it to 8. Remember, you can set those to whatever you want. So all you got to do now is press save, and then we're going to save it over the top of this parts of interest.json. So there we go, that's that, and now we can start looking at what code changes we need to do to make this work. So the main thing that's going to be interesting to use for multiple models in the post side is this API call here, which is workflow.number of selected models. Now this code is within the version 20 of the post entities of interest code. So this is slightly more in depth. So some things in here are going to be different to our parts of interest, such as this data.entities of interest type. Things like that you can just ignore, but hopefully this is similar-ish to the code that we had in our parts of interest script, so that you can still get the gist of it. So here, this number.workflow of selected models is going to return the number of models selected by the user. So when someone is using multiple models, they don't have to select every single model that they've got available in their post session to use. So they could, for example, only select the second and the fourth model to use within their workflow. So once you've done that, we're then going to loop through those. So to then set the model ID, we'll do workflow.modelID from index, which returns the ID of the model selected by the user by the index. So once we've done that, we can then get the data from that model using the normal workflow.model user data from index. So before, you just remember we put workflow.model user data from index and we passed in 0. This time we're going to pass in M, which is where we get this number of selected models from. Then once we've done that, we can set current model to that model ID and do all sorts of different things, which is just going to do specific things to that model. But just need to remember that for a lot of this stuff, you're going to have to start looping through all the models that you've selected. Now, there is lots of other changes that you'd have to make to the code if you'd want to get your workflow working from a single model workflow to a multiple model workflow, all around the other functions. However, they don't contain any specific workflows JavaScript API calls, so I'm just going to leave that and just quickly show you a demo now, just as an example. So, using the entities of interest one, we're going to run this. So this is in Oasys 20, and for example, we might want to go and highlight all the dummies on the different models. So we just click highlight, and then eventually they'll all pop up. And there you go. That's one example, and then we can maybe only just the wheels on models 1 and 3. Click only, and the other ones aren't going to change. So that's just an example of how the multiple models might work in reality. So after completing showing you the multiple model workflows, as a summary, it's all about using the functions in the Oasys JavaScript API workflow class that I mentioned before we created the first basic PostScript. We use a number of selected models called to see how many models are selected. Then we can loop through those selected models and get the data for each one using model user data from index. So that brings us to the end of the webinar on how to create your workflow. Remember to start with creating a pre-script, then a PostScript, then create the workflow definition file. Start simple and build from there to add new features to make your workflow more advanced, including things like making your workflow work with multiple models. To finish, it is worth noting that if you want to, you could create the workflow definition file first and link it to an empty pre and post script, and then build up those empty scripts from there. Some people prefer that method. Please get in touch if you need help creating your workflow, or even if you have an idea for a workflow that you might want us to create.